In a live stream, Matt Colville once asked how much gender is socially constructed versus how much of it is biological. The answer to the question is that gender, specifically that word, gender is 100% socially constructed. It is entirely socially constructed. Basically, only humans have gender, frankly. That's not necessarily the same thing as sex, despite the fact that we almost try to use it as though it is the same word. And the reason that it is important to specify is that gender is performative, which means that a person responds to the way that society informs them about gender and then expresses with that information who they are in a way that creates that sphere of behavior in collectivity. The individual behaves according to the information provided by the society and simultaneously provides their share of that information in their performativity, in the performance of the gender that they take on. Sex, on the other hand, is also partially socially constructed, but that is to a degree that is probably not only not fixed, but is almost impossible to disconnect from the biology of the situation. One of the reasons this is true is that we're only just now figuring out how weird some of the biology in that situation is, because we had a very simple understanding of how human sexuality worked because of how we breed mostly, before we started to understand genetics. And there are a lot of things going on in neurology as well that make trying to track down what makes a man, what makes a woman, and limiting the human experience to those two things very difficult. And on a scientific level, technically impossible. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into, well, anything, frankly. These videos are short as hell, and I hate that. But the reason why it's important to note that these things are different is because the way that gender works is extremely social in nature. And that means that when a society goes through various changes, as all societies do, then the meanings of man and woman, or the meanings of marriage, the meanings of different kinds of mated partnerships, how people are sexualized, how people are educated about the roles that they will play in their society, and what makes up those roles, the concepts of masculinity and femininity, they change, they evolve, they intermingle with ideas from different cultures which have different concepts, where there's this weird tendency, I fucking know, I'm really annoyed by it. People have a tendency to land in this weird Dawkinian mindset where they presuppose that evolution created suits and ties and dresses, and that this is just part of how genitals work in some way that genetics should surely show. But we know that that's not true, because human genetics is way more complicated than that. But we went into human genetics with ideas that we already had as a society, which thinkers like Edmund Husserl and the postmodernists that I've studied from have forced us to call into question, because you have to know where your information comes from when you form a hypothesis, just like you need to know where your information comes from when you test that hypothesis. The scientific method doesn't start at a hypothesis. It actually starts long before that. I mean, hell, you have to educate scientists before they become scientists. That has a lot to do with preparatory thought too. Just like people performing their genders have got these ideas put into their heads by the society around them on a metaconscious level, so too have scientists, right? And so when scientists go into something assuming that they're going to find that men and women are created by genetics, that's what they find. But then, as the work goes on, and it turns out to be a lot more complicated than that, with double XYs, X double Ys, people with things like chromosomal damage, or who've been subject to epigenetic factors, or who are trans people, and none of this has anything to do at all with sexualities, which are their own complicated ball of wax, that has a lot to do with how gender winds up being performed as well. All of these extremely complex things become concomitant. So in gender, what you actually have is a series of ways that people can act within society in order to represent society's ideas of the various roles that a person can play. And that has tended to be a man or a woman in a lot of societies. But even then, there's exceptions. And there always have been, by the way. The idea that trans people are new is preposterous. That there's always been things like that and homosexuality in all societies that anthropology has ever studied. And then when we talk about sex, things are a lot more complicated scientifically than just being able to say that a society decides or that genetics decides, or even just how reproduction works. Hermaphrodisia, for example, complicates a lot of that. Some people are born with genetic things with their bodies that make it impossible for them to reproduce at all. So are those people, do they even have a sex at that point, if we define it by whether or not they can create offspring through this particular means? And the answer to that should probably be no. Especially if we expect that to help them to decide how they perform their gender, right? Thank you for your time.